Hey, you guys. And I just have the greatest pleasure of introducing my friend Kim Culbertson. Every year I catch her presentation at the Sierra Writers Conference, and I call it my annual pep talk. So you're in for a real treat. So, Kim is the author of the YA novel Songs for a Teenage Nomad, published by Sourcebooks in 2010. Instructions for a Broken Heart by Sourcebooks in 2011, and that book won the 2012 Northern California Book Award for YA fiction. There's also Catch a Falling Star, published by Scholastic, The Possibility of Now, also by Scholastic, which was named a Bank Street Best Children's Book of the Year in 2017. And there's also The Wonder of Us, published by Scholastic and Walker Books. Much of her inspiration comes from her background teaching high school since 1997. In 2012, Kim wrote her ebook novella, The Liberation of Max McTrue, for her students, who over the years have taught her far more than she has taught them. Kim lives in Northern California with her husband and her daughter. And please join me in giving a warm welcome, perhaps with a reaction emoji, to Kim Culbertson.
Thank you so much, Rachel. And I just want to apologize for jumping on Joe's toes there. At the end, I didn't realize my screen was sharing. I was making sure it was the right page. So thank you to Joe for those wonderful books. And for all he does with that press. I want to just welcome everyone here to Sierra Writers. This is one of my favorite things I do each year as a writer, is be part of the Sierra Writers Conference. And even though I know this year is a little strange that we're on Zoom and we're all sitting here from the comfort of our own offices or yards or bedrooms or wherever we are, I just want to take a minute to thank everyone for being here in this specific time and place where we are right now. It's really special to share all of these writing things during this very strange time. The only thing I keep reminding myself is that this is giving me a lot to write about. And so that's how I kind of give myself my own little pep talk every morning, is that this is going to be something worth writing about eventually. Okay, well, I wanted to just share, I'm going to kind of scroll through this handout as we go. I have some excerpts from books that I'll be sharing with you to talk about my topic today, which is the world you build for them. And by them, I am purposely being a little bit sly, because I do mean your characters in your books, that we do build our worlds for them, but also our readers. And so I want to just take a minute to thank all the people out there who buy books and who read, because really what we do with our storytelling is very much for you as readers. So I'm very grateful and appreciate you. I'm always kind of amazed at how many people will still write me and say they've read something I've written. It's a form of magic, I think. All right, well, we are talking today. I wrote a blog post for Sierra Writers Conference and for Sierra College that was basically talking about the intersection between voice, character, and world building. And by world building, I'm really going to talk about the way we use setting and a sense of place in our work to create a world around our characters. But because this conference is titled Empowering Voices, I did want to give a nod and start off with a discussion about voice. Voice is a tricky concept in writing. I am often told that I'm a voicey writer. And originally, I was always a little bit sort of wondering what that meant when I first started writing. But I've grown pretty comfortable with it as a concept. I will say that I think voice is one of the most challenging things to teach as far as technique and writing style. I have people who sometimes write me, because I do writing coaching and I edit manuscripts privately, and they'll say, like, will you help me be more voicey? And it's always where I feel a little stumped as an editor, because voice is such it's so dependent on that specific writer identifying his or her or their voice. And so it's hard for me to tell you as your editor or your manuscript coach what that is until I see it. So what I do often in my editorial work is I try to find places where I feel like I can really see your voice in the work. But as far as a voice, a loose definition of it is that it can be described as an author's style. I do think it's more than that, and we'll get into that in a minute. But there are some writers in the world, I can think of John Green, I'm going to share Frederick Bachman's work with you in a second, who are just naturally voicey. When you read something they've written, you can almost immediately go, oh, that's John Green, or that's Frederick Bachman. You just know it. You know it by the way they shape their sentences. In my own work, I know in my blog post, I wrote about my fourth novel, The Possibility of Now. When I first turned that manuscript into my editor at Scholastic, her biggest note back to me was she didn't think it sounded enough like me, like it needed more Kimness. And so that is something I talked about here about your you-ness. And so when you hear you-ness, it's YOU -NESS. That's what I mean, is that you're trying to embody that you-ness in your work with your voice. There's also, of course, besides the authorial voice, which is your style and how some authors get described as voicey, there's your characters' voices too. And those are different depending on which point of view you've decided to write in. They're different depending on what kind of tense you're using. They're representative a lot in dialogue and places like that. And we can talk about that more a little bit later as well. But to give you an example of voice, I wanted to scroll down and share a passage with you from Frederick Bachman's new book, Anxious People. It came out in this country in 2020. And for whatever reason, I've read probably over 100 books in the last year because we haven't had much else to do. And this was probably the voiciest book I read in 2020. And so I thought I would share a page of it with you and I would just read it to you so you could hear kind of what I mean by voicey. And this is again from Frederick Bachman's Anxious People. The man on the bridge 10 years ago and the bank robber who took people hostage at an apartment viewing aren't connected. They never met each other. The only thing they really have in common is moral hazard. That's a banking term, of course. Someone had to come up with it to describe the way the financial markets work, because the fact that banks are immoral is so obvious to us that simply calling them immoral wasn't enough. We needed a way to describe the fact that it's so unlikely that a bank would ever behave morally that it can only be considered a risk for them even to try. The man on the bridge gave his money to a bank so that they could make secure investments, because all investments were secure in those days. Then the man used these secure investments as security against loans, and then he took out new loans to pay off the old ones. Everyone does this, the bank said, and the man thought, they're the ones who should know. Then one day, all of a sudden, nothing was secure anymore. It was called a crisis in the financial markets, a bank crash, even though the only ones who crash are people. The banks are still there. The financial markets have no heart that can be broken. But for the man on the bridge, a whole life savings had been replaced by a mountain of debt, and no one could explain how that had happened. When the man pointed out that the bank had promised that this was entirely risk-free, the bank threw out its arms and said, nothing's entirely risk-free. You should have known that you should have known what you were getting into. You shouldn't have given us your money. So the man went to another bank to borrow money to pay off the debts he now had because the first bank had lost all of his savings. He explained to the second bank that he might lose his business otherwise, then his home, and he told them he had 2 children. The second bank nodded and was very understanding, but a woman who worked there told him, you've suffered what we call a moral hazard. Okay. The whole novel is like that. It's manic and it's a ping-pongy narrative. It's really all over the place in the storylines. It's excellent, by the way, as a book, but it works because it's in his very capable hands. But I just wanted to kind of go over a few things that he's doing in that piece to be voicey and to create that kind of feel of voice. Voice, I think, has a lot to do in your stylistic choices around tone and around emotion. So in this book, he's obviously choosing to be really conversational and also frenetic. He's choosing these kind of really quick sentences. I like to show you just even the way it looks on the page. It's like a huge block of writing. He's really slamming that into the reader's face about like, here's all of this information really fast all at once. He's using dialogue in really interesting ways because it's all in reflection. So he's talking about what people have said in the past to this person. Everyone does this, the bank said. They're the ones who should know, the man says. So what's interesting here too is that he's not giving us character names. The characters are the man on the bridge, the bank robber, and the banks, and the lady at the bank. And so it's really interesting choices he's making in here narratively that give us that kind of really frenetic, voicey feel. My favorite little voicey moment of his in the entire page is, that's a banking term, of course. So little things like that are little nods to the reader. They're a little like, hey, wink, wink at the reader, like, you're in on this with me. You're in on this with the voice of this author. And so that's another place where his voice is really prominent. All right, we'll scroll back up here. The next element that we're going to be really looking at today in our own work and when we're practicing our work is the idea of character and its relationship to voice and its relationship to the rest of the elements that we're going to be looking at. Character is obvious, I think, when I say what is its function. Obviously, these are the people who populate our worlds. And so our choices are our main character or our protagonist if we have a first person or third person close point of view. We can be really in that character. If you're writing memoir, character is you. You're the character of that story, and your point of view is driving the engine of that story. I think that poems also have characters, and not necessarily quite as regularly as maybe a novel does, or as plays or scripts or memoirs do, but they can be there and they can populate it. I think confessional poetry, for example, it's very clear that that's almost like an authorial voice coming through when someone designates their work as confessional poetry. I think of Gail Entrekin. When I think of confessional poets, her work is she's her own character and she's her main character in her poems. And if you haven't read Gail Entrekin's poems, they are just absolutely fabulous. They're as far as that sort of voice driving the work. So the thing that makes our characters so special in our work is that idea of specific details. And I know Devi talked about that in her workshop earlier, that idea of bringing in sensory details and like giving us like sometimes two in each sentence. I think she said, Lucille Clifton said that, and I thought that was really cool. But specific details really drive a character because it takes our characters out of being two-dimensional and flat and brings them into being three-dimensional and round. And so for an example of character, I wanted to scroll down to a piece of writing from Ivy Pachoda from Visitation Street, which is a mystery detective type novel and set in New York. And this is a scene from a police station. And the character is on the other side of this. He's in a room that's soundproof. And there's something for me about the way this character accesses his environment. I also am going to come back to talking about this scene when we talk about setting and world building in a second. But I just really love the descriptions that this character just by what he's seeing. And so I'll read this to you. The room is soundproof. He watches the police move around as if they're in a silent movie. He watches the pantomime of their lips against the receivers of their beige desk phones. Without noise, their business loses its urgency and becomes slapstick. The muted rush of two detectives grabbing their jackets from their chairs and dashing for the door. The comic exaggeration of the station chief chewing out an uniformed officer. When two detectives enter his room, they bring with them a tumble of noise. The ringing telephones, radio static, the metallic slam of desk drawers. Then the door closes and it is silent again. I know the girl, Jonathan says before the detectives have a chance to sit down. Is she okay? One of the detectives drops a manila folder onto the table. He's heavyset. He wears a tan suit. There are threads dangling from Detective Coover's green and blue striped tie. His partner, Hughes, is younger and wears a navy suit that's a little too sharp for the station. He leans against the window and crosses his arms as if he has somewhere better to be. You teach either of them? Hoover says. No, they never signed up for my class. You see either girl last night? I was in the bar last night. I made a scene. Ask any of the regulars. Then I went to bed. The bartender will tell you. Jonathan looks at the clock. You got into a fight last night? Hughes says. Jonathan suspects that he's recently been promoted. His inflection rises at the tail of his sentences, leaning greedily towards the next conclusion. Jonathan shakes his head. I sang a show tune. Too loud. Hughes glances at his partner, but doesn't catch his eye. A show tune? Jesus. Okay. So there's 3 characters in that scene that are worth sort of diving into and looking at what this author's doing with. I actually think if you've read any of Ivy Pachoda's book, she's a very voicey writer too. Like you can really recognize her sentences have a very special shape to them. She uses a lot of dashes in her work, which I really like these here. I just like her work. It's really interesting. And she writes, if you're a detective fan, this is very atmospheric detective novel. But if we look at his point of view, one of the things to always remember when you're building this world for your characters and you're writing your own memoir world is your point of view establishes what the reader is seeing. So because we're from Jonathan's point of view in this scene, we're watching this world in only the way Jonathan can consume it. And so he's noticing things like without noise, their business loses its urgency and becomes slapstick, the muted rush of the 2 detectives grabbing their jackets. He's noticing everything. So our lens that we're getting from this character is that he's incredibly observant, actually. He's seeing a lot. He's noticing a lot. He's seeing that these detectives are distinct from each other. There's one who's kind of shabby and threadbare, and there's one who's been in it a while. And then there's the younger one who seems a little too sharp for the station. Like he's clearly ambitious. He's clearly working his way up. The dialogue is really crisp. You see the way that that's being organized in the scene. And then you see Jonathan's, his sense of humor comes through in this scene. He's being questioned about a missing girl. And he's like, I made a scene. I was in a bar last night. I made a scene. Ask any of the regulars. Then I went to bed. The bartender will tell you. And then he looks at the clock, which is, I love that line. It's so specific. It's such a specific action. And so when you're developing your characters, you can describe them. That's useful. You can use dialogue to show them, but you also can build in who they are through their actions. Like, what are they doing around their dialogue? What are they doing around the descriptions of them? Give them that action. And you can do this in your memoirs too, and in your narrative nonfiction, is just looking for those places where your dialogue and your action tie in together. You got into a fight last night, Hughes says. So he's bringing him back to the scene with this idea of there's like almost this accusatory kind of trying to make a connection to the missing girl. And then you see this humor again from Jonathan saying a show tune too loud, right? And so then the detective, I love that end point she has in the end, a show tune, Jesus. So you see the end, that character in those like specific details, but what she's also doing in that scene, as I mentioned here, is it's an engine for conflict and tension and plot. She's using character and these characters playing off of each other to create tension in her scene and to demonstrate the conflict of the overall novel, which is they're trying to find these girls, these 2 girls who've gone missing. They were there yesterday, they're not there today. They don't know where these girls are. So that's just a really, I thought, kind of cool like look at how like voice and character and conflict all intersect in that scene. And then the last thing we're going to be talking about before we start practicing our own writing, and I promise you, you've got plenty of time to do your own writing in this workshop. I won't talk this whole time, is world building. And I'm using world building here to really look at the idea of setting and sense of place. And what its function is to create a place for our characters to inhabit and a place for our world to exist in. I teach high school creative writing, and one of the first things I talk about with my students is that our job as authors, as writers of stories, whether that story is being channeled through a novel or a short story or a poem or a play, is to be professional noticers, that our job is to notice the world as we live in it and as our characters live in it, and then to be able to recreate that on the page for our readers, because everything that exists in our own minds, the amazing magical part of being a writer is getting that image and all of that, information to translate onto the page in a way that anchors our characters and makes our readers feel like they're participating in a real three-dimensional place. Debbie mentioned this early in her workshop, but that idea of sensory detail, smell, taste, touch, sight, sound, we should be incorporating all of these throughout our work and throughout our different sort of devices. It's so important to make sure that our work feels full and rich of sights and sounds and tastes and smells, and all of these things that make for the world as interesting as it has been. I've had to go throughout this last year, because I've been so tied to my office during this crazy time. I've had to force myself sometimes to go on walks or go walk around places I'm not used to spending time in, just to remind myself that there are these other smells and tastes and touch and sights and sounds out. And so I really encourage you in the next couple of days, if you're feeling all lit up from this amazing conference and you're feeling like, I want to go write something, to do what I like to call writing on the road, which is like, go do a walkabout and just like walk around and smell things and touch things and taste things and just see what things, I mean, obviously don't touch other humans, stay 6 feet apart, of course, but like just be out in the world if you can in a safe way to like, try on all these different sensory functions. So I'm going to scan down. We're going to come back to Ivy's scene in a second, but we're going to scan down to one of my favorite memoirs, which is Trevor Noah's Born a Crime. And he's talking in this scene. I don't know if everyone's familiar with Trevor Noah. He's a Daily Show host, but he also wrote an excellent, excellent book, and I highly recommend it. His book is, I think he might be coming out with a second one. I'm really looking forward to it. But his book is basically about his childhood in South Africa, and particularly his relationship with his mom comes up a lot in the book. And so I wanted to share this scene where he talks about his mother, and it starts kind of like down here. If we weren't at school or work or church, we were out exploring. My mom's attitude was, I chose you, kid. I brought you into this world, and I'm going to give you everything I never had. She poured herself into me. She would find places for us to go where we didn't have to spend money. We must have gone to every park in Johannesburg. My mom would sit under a tree and read the Bible, and I'd run and play and play and play. On Sunday afternoons after church, we'd go for drives out in the country. My mom would find places with beautiful views for us to sit and have a picnic. There was none of the fanfare of a picnic basket or plates or anything like that, only bologna and brown bread and margarine sandwiches wrapped up in butcher paper. To this day, bologna and brown bread and margarine will instantly take me back. You can come with all the Michelin stars in the world. Just give me bologna and brown bread and margarine, and I'm in heaven. Food, or the access to food, was always the measure of how good or bad things were going in our lives. My mom would always say, my job is to feed your body, feed your spirit, feed your mind. That's exactly what she did. And the way she found money for food and books was to spend absolutely nothing on anything else. Her frugality was the stuff of legend. Our car was a tin can on wheels, and we lived in the middle of nowhere. We had threadbare furniture, busted old sofas with holes worn through the fabric. Our TV was a tiny black and white with a bunny aerial on top. We changed the channels using a pair of pliers because the buttons didn't work. Most of the time, you had to squint to see what was going on. Okay, so that's Trevor. He's really a funny guy. He has a wonderful, wry, very heartfelt sense of humor. Those of you who watch him on The Daily Show know that he's also incredibly deep feeling and smart. And this book just he runs all of that. Like in this book, he runs all of those different levels of himself. But I specifically wanted to bring your attention to the idea of the food. And I'm chuckling because Debbie did that this morning too in her workshop about food. But food often can really like bring us back to things and can remind us of things. And his whole idea that bologna and brown bread and margarine brings him back to those childhood moments with his mother. And so looking for the places in your work where you can anchor your reader to these memories of your characters. It's a really useful way to build character and to build setting. I love his descriptions of the home. The car is a tin can on wheels. Their furniture was threadbare. The TV was tiny, black and white with a bunny aerial. We changed the channels using a pair of pliers because the buttons didn't work. That particular sentence is just so specifically excellent. And so I'm just looking for places. The more you can get rid of generalizations in your writing and paint the specific picture for your reader, show them the world rather than tell them about the world. I know show and tell it's like overused and we talk about it too much, but you can always choose, I think, to be specific. Like even Sands Hall does a wonderful description of summary and scene in her book and the difference between those two things. And so if you get an opportunity to ever read her book about that, she explains it much more, she explains it better than I do. So just anytime you have the opportunity to be specific instead of being general, that's what I want you really thinking about when you practice your world building exercises. The world of this detective room, again, we see these details of the room. We see the detectives, we see the manila folder, we see the green and blue striped tie. We see all of these little specific things, the clock on the wall. He leans against the window and crosses his arms as if he has somewhere better to be. These are all little gestures and moments and specifics that build this world. I love this scene especially, and this is what I want to talk about as far as setting, is it goes from being a silent place. She uses sound so beautifully in this passage. It goes from being silent to being noisy. And it tumbles in, and then the door closes again and it's silent again. So you have this like moment of him being in this bubble of silence. The detectives spill in, the ringing telephones, the static, the metallic slam of desk drawers, and then boom, the door closes and is silent again. So it's a really beautiful use of sound that you don't always see in prose. You don't always hear people talk about what they're hearing. All right, so these are the three things. All of the elements we use to create stories come together to build this world. And we're going to really focus on voice, character, and world building today. But of course, I want to encourage you in your writing practice to practice all of the other stuff we brought up today too. The idea of dialogue, possibly if you want to keep writing more about you want to look at setting more closely, that's and tone. So we're going to do a little exercise. I'm going to stop talking for a while because I think you've just like heard enough from me for a while. But we're going to do an exercise that I love, that it's inspired by my mentor at my MFA program, the RWW, which is the Rainier Writing Workshop. And this is Scott Nadelson's, who was my fiction mentor, and he's a beautiful writer. And he used to do this with us to just get us, kind of shake us up a little bit and get us outside of our heads a little bit. So the first thing I'd like you to do, if you have, you can write on a piece of paper, you can tap on your laptop, whatever, but you're going to come up with an idea for a character. And the character can be, you can say a 35-year-old woman who is a teacher, whatever you want to do for your character. But I want you to just try to jot down, like just pull a random character out of the world. If you'd like to use a character from your work in progress, obviously I won't know that you're doing that. So like do whatever feels best for you. while you do this practice, but you're wanting to take just 2 minutes and list as many specific details as you can about this character. And specific details don't just mean what this character looks like. I actually think appearance is the least interesting part of a character. And so I'm more interested in like their values, their likes, their dislikes, their dreams, their professional hopes, how many children they have, if they decided not to have children, what are some of their regrets? So like just listing as many character specific details as you can for this character that you're gonna do a writing practice around. All right, I'm gonna give you 2 minutes and I'm gonna shut up and let you write for 2 minutes, character details. All right, 2 minutes. Okay, so that was 2 minutes of character details. Hopefully you have a pretty three-dimensional type character you can work with, but set that aside for a minute. We're going to make a list. We're actually going to make 2 lists. I want you to number from 1 to 5 on one side of your page or at the top of your page or wherever you have space, and label it emotion. And on the setting side of the list, I want you to just list 5 possible settings. So obviously, you know what an emotion is: fear, sadness, joy. Settings are, cafe, the beach, football stadium, whatever you want to do for your 5. But I want you to put 5 distinct emotions down on the page and 5 distinct settings. And I'm going to give you a minute to do that. Don't think about it too much, just whatever comes into your head at first. I love lists because I feel like they just clear our head. So 5 emotions and 5 settings. Okay, once you have those, I want you to circle your third emotion. So whatever your number 3 was on emotion, I want you to circle it. On your setting list, I want you to circle the first one. Whatever your first setting was, I want you to circle it. You probably see where I'm going with this. This is an exercise that Scott had us do pretty regularly in my MFA program, especially if we were feeling stuck on a scene. He would have us create these lists and then put our character into that setting feeling that way. And so I want you to write, you're going to write for 10 minutes. I want you to write a scene with a clear beginning, middle, and end, scene structure, where your character is feeling whatever they're feeling in this place. And I want you to use those things like we talked about through those 3 excerpts. I want you to think about, this character's voice, your voice as a writer. I want you to think about what this character wants in this scene. What are they feeling? Why are they feeling it? Do they want to stay feeling like this? Are they trying to get out of it? And I want you to use all that sensory detail that we talked about to describe that place that they're existing in. So for 10 minutes, you've got your character feeling this way in their body and living or existing in this particular setting. And so I'm gonna give you 10 minutes. I'm actually gonna turn my mic off. And just do whatever you can do for 10 minutes and just write this scene with your specific character. Okay, ready and start. All right, so you have about a minute left. So go ahead and try to find a landing for your scene. Just trying to find a way to close it if possible. Okay, so that was 10 minutes. I'm always struck with how long 10 minutes can actually feel. It's kind of amazing to me. So I want you, for this next little exercise piece, I want you to read over that scene you created. You have a character, you have this character feeling something, and you have them living and housed somewhere. So they're in an environment, they're in a setting. And I want you to think about how those parts of that story interrelate with each other. So, how does where they are, if they're in a cafe, how does that relate to their feelings of frustration for this character? And then for this next exercise, I want you to consider what would happen if you moved this character out of this mindset, out of this feeling, into a different feeling and into a different setting. So you're taking this idea that this character wants something. You still have the same things at stake. You still have the same things that are frustrating to this character or what they want. And then you're moving them into a different emotional space and you're moving them into a different setting. Like, for example, instead of setting them somewhere public, could you set them somewhere private and have it change the circumstances? This is simply a disruptive tool that's used to challenge you and to challenge you to think about your character in a different way, in a different mindset. I just watched a really cool TED Talk with my class. I posted it on my Facebook page, and I'm completely blanking on the speaker now. He's a very cool British guy. But it had to do with how frustration can actually make us more creative. And like by causing disruption in our own habits, we can find things we didn't know we were capable of doing. And so I wanted to practice that disruption a little bit in this scene. So look at your scene and think about, what if my character was feeling in an opposite way to the way I wrote this scene? What if they were somewhere else? They weren't in this specific setting. And then I want you to take 5 minutes and simply rewrite that moment or one of the moments or one of the passages in that scene from the new emotional mindset of this character and in a new setting, and see if that impacts your character in any way. I'm just simply asking you to try it. Perhaps you just wrote a perfect scene and it's exactly what it should be, but just disrupt it a little and see where you go. Take them from somewhere. If they're somewhere public, put them somewhere private. If they're in sort of a negative headspace, put them in a positive headspace and vice versa. So just try to reverse those things. And I'll give you 5 minutes to do that. Starting now. Okay, that was 5 minutes. So now you have these two pieces in front of you, one with a very different emotional character and setting than the next one. And so I really want you to consider this when you're working on your work in progress, when you're looking at your own novel, your own short stories, your own memoirs and poems. In the study of writing, we often break things into parts. We break things down into character and voice and setting and theme and conflict and plot. And this is necessary and good. I think it's really important that we are able as writers to look at our work and say, what am I doing with character in this scene? What am I doing with setting? What am I doing as far as my thematic work in this scene? However, it's that intersection. It's the way that these things all play off of each other and the way they work in relationship to each other that ultimately creates an interesting narrative in a story. So I'm going to give you a cookie metaphor. And that's basically that each of those things, your character, your voice, your setting, your sentences, like the specific details, all of that, those are your ingredients. And how you mix those all together and shape them and form them and bake them is your story. And I'd like to think that our voice, just to come back in conclusion to what this whole workshop today was kind of kicking off with in voice, is the way your voice is how you like your cookies. It's like the way you bake them. Or do you underbake them? Do you overbake them? Do you like them crispy? Do you like them chewy? Everybody has a different thing that makes something a perfect cookie for them. There's no one perfect cookie out there for everybody. And so like your voice is how you like your cookies. And so sorry for the cookie metaphor, but it's really important to think about all of these things and the way they play together as your ingredients. And then your voice is sort of how you cook them in the long run. So that is all I have as far as like what I've prepared for all of you today. And I did want to leave some time for questions. Rachel, feel free to jump back on here and navigate this with me if you would like to. Awesome. If people can put the questions in the chat, I guess is how we're doing it.
Okay. Yeah, totally. So if you have questions for Kim, or if you'd like to share how that exercise was for you and share kind of your experience, that'd be great too. Just go ahead and put that in the chat. And that was just a really fun exercise. I really enjoyed it. And the 10 minutes went by very, very quickly. So
I'm glad to hear that. Sometimes 10 minutes feels long and sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah. So let's see. Well, nothing in the chat yet, but oh, here we go. 10 minutes can be a lifetime, says Michelle. It's true.
My daughter, who's currently studying for the SAT, would agree with you.
I'm sorry. Yeah, that's a doozy. So maybe you could tell us a little bit like using this exercise when you're stuck in a scene or something like that. If you could tell us a little bit about your process.
Fabulous. Yeah, of course. So I'm currently working on a novel for adults. I've written 5 YA novels, and I'm taking a big leap here writing for people who are over the age of 18. But one thing I'm noticing is that because I'm using 3 different point of views, that I have to be really careful not to overlap them. And so I use these exercises a lot in practicing the point of view of each of my 3 characters. So what does Evan sound like sad? What does Chelsea sound like sad? What does Nora sound like sad? What do they sound like when they're anxious and looking forward to something? What do they sound? So I practice putting them in a scene sometimes and just changing up their emotions so that I can make sure then I read it back out loud to myself that Chelsea doesn't sound like Evan and Evan doesn't sound like Nora. And just, I don't know if I'm succeeding, but it's how I practice trying to keep those point of views distinct from each other. I had a professor in my MFA program who said, when you're feeling lost in a scene, go back into the character's body and be with them. What are they feeling? What are they thinking? Where are they sitting in that current moment? How are they housed? So like, how is their environment impacting their specific body? And that just helps put us back into that character in like a whole way.
Yeah, I'm really glad you said that because especially I mean, it's almost meta. I mean, in this era of like I'm a talking head on Zoom and you're all the way across town and we're like on the internet, it can be so hard to and in writing too, it can be very cerebral. We can get very caught up in
Yeah.
the page or the computer screen. So that's a really wonderful point. And I have a question. It was sent to me as a direct message, so I won't say the name of the person. But the question was, how do we keep out voice from interfering with character voice?
Oh, I love that. That is such a good question. That whole, when does the authorial voice interfere with the character voice? That is so much about mindfulness. Like that's about you being super clear what your character would think and feel, and not letting what you would think and feel step on those toes. It's really hard. Here's a perfect example. It was actually from one of Sands Hall's workshops. There was apparently a horse was the point of view, and the horse described something as being as big as a cruise ship in this person's writing. And it came up in the, in the critique, why would this horse know what a cruise ship looks like? So the authorial voice in that moment was the cruise ship, was the horse, and was the cruise ship. The author knew what a cruise ship looked like. The horse doesn't. So it's always being clear that if your main character is a dancer, that's going to inform what they see and how they notice things. It's like Jonathan in that scene from Ivy's book. He's noticing different things because of who he is. And so being really attuned. I think the better we know our characters, the more we avoid that. We avoid that overlap. And then sometimes your choice is just that your authorial voice gets to step all over wherever it wants. Right. I think Frederick Bachman makes that choice a lot, where his author just comes into the page whenever he feels like storming the castle.
Right. So I guess it depends what you're going for.
Exactly.
But watch out for horses on cruise ships because
right.
that's just crazy.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, we have somebody getting a cookie because they really needed a cookie after your cookie pep talk.
I love that, Janet.
We have a question from Lynette. Do you worry about not having enough ability to create a character who lives a very different life than yours? How do you make that character authentic?
That is $1 million question, especially honestly in the age of that we're living in right now, which is that we need to be incredibly respectful of marginalized voices. And so if we are pursuing a voice or a point of view from a marginalized voice, how are we going about being respectful about that and making sure that we have sensitivity readers, that we have people who have lived in those shoes, perhaps mindful of that and helping us with that. But I do also, I mean, when she says, do you worry about, oh my gosh, I think that's like our primary engine as a writer, is worrying that we're doing something that's not authentic. However, I do really truly believe in imagination. And really trying to get into the head of, and the specific, I think the more you can be specific and you can create a specific person who's not a stereotype, the more you avoid being inauthentic in your work, making sure this character is fully realized and not just a caricature of something you saw on TV or a carbon copy of what you imagined that person's life must be. Yeah, I think it comes down to empathy. It's like really harness your empathy if you're working with a character who's outside of your own experiences.
Right. And could you talk about how you would bring specificity into a character like that to help bring them alive on the page?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's where those lovely lists come into play, where you start creating all those things about them that you might not even eventually use. You might not need to know what their favorite food is or what they hated eating when they were little, but it helps to know it because it like informs them. And then this is where my theater background comes in. I was a drama teacher for many years, and theater artist. And, that getting to know the wholeness of your character before you say any of the lines.
Got it.
Yeah. And I'm actually noticing someone asked about
Yes.
dialogue. Okay.
I'll read the question aloud to just so everybody has it. How do you make dialogue authentic, especially in a period piece? Where do you research the language used from that era, etc.? From
Oh my goodness.
Justine.
So I'm not a historical writer, probably because I'm terrified of that question. But I do think that what you should do is read other writers who do that well. Like, how are they handling dialogue from a particular period or piece? And maybe it comes down to slang. That's usually like a simple solution, just to throw it in, to pepper it in here and there. I also think it's really important to not get completely hung up on that. And like, obviously you don't want them to sound like they're from California and were raised in the 90s, like I am, like, if you're writing in the 1800s. But I think you can pepper a few things in to give it specifics. I think, who does that really well in his new book is Jess Walter in The Cold Millions. It's set in 1906. And there's never a time in that book where I felt popped out of the time period because of the dialogue, but it didn't feel heavy-handed either. It didn't look like he looked up like a glossary of slang from 1906 and it was just everywhere. He did such a good job with that. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, we've got a minute. Thank you, she says.
Oh,
so we've got a couple minutes left. If anybody has one last question, otherwise I'll just say I love that this gets to be so interactive and we get to write together, even though we're all far apart. So
I'm really grateful for that as well. I thoroughly enjoyed Debbie's workshop this morning. I wrote actually 3 pages and I was thrilled. I was like, wow, I didn't expect to write 3 pages today. So yeah, I think Debbie's whole notebook thing is so great. Anytime you can just sit down and write for 10 minutes a day, 15 minutes a day. I mean, I can't remember. I think it was Grant Faulkner last year who said Toni Morrison wrote a novel for 15 minutes a day. And so really just giving yourself that time every day to write is so special and important. And I know for me, it has been a real anchor during this crazy year.
I'm into that. Yeah, definitely. I at least get in 5 minutes, if nothing else. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay,
Great.
cool. Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Kim. This has just been really enjoyable. We're getting some comments. Everybody saying thank you.
Thank you to everyone who participated. I'm so grateful. And thank you to Sierra Writers for having me.
Thank you so much.